The rhythm of your own heartbeat is a comforting sound until it starts to sync up with the footsteps of someone you cannot see. I have always preferred running at 2 in the morning because the air is crisp and the city feels like a ghost town that belongs only to me. The streetlights in the park cast long, amber pools of light on the asphalt, creating a series of islands in a sea of ink-black shadows. I was 3 miles into my route, my lungs burning with the cold air and my music turned down low enough to hear the wind, when I first noticed the echo. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my own sneakers hitting the ground, bouncing off the concrete retaining walls that line the path. But as I slowed my pace to catch my breath, the second set of footsteps didn't immediately stop, trailing off just a fraction of a second after mine. I didn't turn around right away because I didn't want to confirm the knot of dread tightening in my stomach. I told myself it was another runner, perhaps someone just as restless as I was, but there was something wrong with the way they were moving. They were staying exactly 10 paces behind me, perfectly matched to my stride, never gaining ground and never falling behind. Every time I passed under a streetlight, I looked at the long shadow stretching out in front of me, searching for a second silhouette that shouldn't be there. But the angle of the light was tricky, and the trees cast jagged, dancing shapes that made it impossible to be sure of anything. I decided to test my theory by crossing the wide pedestrian bridge that spanned the local creek, a place where the wood planks would make any footfall much louder. As I stepped onto the timber, I sped up into a sprint, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The sound of my own feet was a thunderous thud, thud, thud. But underneath that noise, I heard it clearly, a lighter, faster tapping that moved with terrifying agility, as if someone were running on their toes to minimize the impact. They weren't just following me, they were hunting me, and they were doing it with a level of athletic precision that made my blood turn to ice. I reached the other side of the bridge and skidded to a halt, spinning around to face the darkness I had just escaped. The bridge was empty, the moonlight reflecting off the dewy wood, but the air felt charged with a presence I couldn't see. "Is someone there?" I shouted, my voice cracking and sounding small against the vast silence of the park. No one answered, and no one emerged from the shadows, but the feeling of being watched was so intense that the hair on my arms stood on end. I stood there for a full minute, my chest heaving, wondering if I was finally losing my mind to the stress of my graveyard shift jobs. I turned back to the path, deciding to cut my run short and head straight for the well-lit main road where the late-night taxis usually gathered. I started to jog again, but this time, I kept my head down and my eyes moving, scanning the bushes and the stone benches for any sign of a person. That was when I heard the breathing. It wasn't my own labored gasping. It was a steady, rhythmic wheezing that seemed to be coming from directly over my left shoulder. It was so close that I could almost feel the warmth of the air hitting the back of my neck. I didn't look back. I simply bolted. I ran faster than I ever had in my life, my vision blurring at the edges as adrenaline flooded my system. I could hear the other runner now, their footsteps no longer trying to be quiet, but instead hitting the ground with a violent, desperate force. They were closing the gap, the sound of their breathing growing louder and more frantic, like a predator that knew its prey was finally exhausted. I reached the edge of the park where the high iron fence separated the greenery from the city streets, and I dove through the pedestrian gate, slamming it shut behind me. I didn't stop until I saw the glow of a 24-hour diner a block away, its neon sign flickering like a beacon of safety in the dark. I collapsed against the brick wall of the building, my legs shaking so hard I could barely stand. Looking back at the park gate, I saw a figure standing perfectly still just inside the fence line. They were dressed entirely in gray, blending almost perfectly into the mist and the shadows of the trees. They didn't move, they didn't wave, and they didn't try to follow me onto the sidewalk. They just stood there, watching me with a cold, detached intensity that made me realize they hadn't been trying to catch me yet. They had just been practicing. I waited inside the diner until the sun began to peek over the horizon, sipping a coffee I couldn't taste while my hands continued to tremble. When I finally walked home in the bright, unforgiving light of morning, I found a small, damp sweatband sitting on my front doorstep. It wasn't mine, and it was still warm to the touch, as if someone had just taken it off after a very long, very intense run. I haven't gone for a jog since that night, and I never leave my house after the sun goes down without checking the shadows behind me twice, because I know that out there, somewhere in the quiet parts of the city, someone is still keeping pace, just waiting for me to start running again. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists in a building that is being torn apart from the inside out. I was working the late shift security detail at the Grand Majestic Hotel, a massive structure that had once been the height of luxury but was now a hollow shell of dust, plastic sheeting, and exposed wiring. My job was simple enough on paper. I had to walk the floors every 2 hours to ensure that no squatters or copper thieves had broken in through the construction entrances. It was 2 in the morning, and the city outside was muffled by a thick layer of fog, making the hotel feel like an island floating in a gray void. I started my round on the 14th floor, my heavy flashlight cutting a lonely path through the darkness that seemed to swallow the light just a few feet in front of me. As I reached the end of the hallway, I realized that the main elevators had been shut down for the night to save power, meaning I would have to use the old service lift at the back of the building. This elevator was a relic from another era, a heavy iron cage with a manual gate that rattled and groaned as if it were complaining about every inch it moved. I stepped inside and pulled the metal screen shut, the sound of the latch clicking into place echoing loudly down the empty corridor. I pressed the button for the lobby, but as the motor began to hum and the floor beneath my feet vibrated, I noticed something that made the hair on my neck stand straight up. On the floor of the elevator, right next to my boot, was a small, orange caution sign that the construction crew used to mark wet floors or tripping hazards. It wasn't just lying there. It had been wedged firmly into the gap of the door, positioned in such a way that it would prevent the outer gate from locking completely on the floors above. I stared at it, my mind racing as I tried to remember if it had been there when I got in, but I knew it hadn't. Someone had placed it there while I was walking the hallway, and they had done it silently enough that I hadn't heard a single footstep. I reached down to pick it up, but just as my fingers touched the plastic, the elevator came to a sudden, jarring halt. We weren't at the lobby. I looked at the flickering floor indicator above the door, but the light was dead, leaving me in total darkness except for the narrow beam of my flashlight. I pressed the lobby button again, then the emergency stop, then the alarm, but the panel was unresponsive, as if the entire system had been bypassed from somewhere else. Then, the elevator began to move again, but it wasn't going up toward the lights of the street level. It was descending, moving slowly and steadily down into the subbasement, a place that was currently flooded with 3 inches of stagnant water and had no working exits. The elevator stopped with a heavy thud, and the gate began to slide open of its own accord, revealing a cavernous room filled with the skeletons of old boilers and rusted pipes. I kept my flashlight aimed at the opening, my hand resting on my radio, but all I could hear was the steady drip, drip, drip of water hitting the concrete floor. "Is someone down here?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and terrified in the massive space. I waited for an answer, but the only response was the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor just beyond the reach of my light. I didn't want to step out into the dark, but I knew that if I stayed in the cage, I was a sitting duck for whoever was controlling the lift. I stepped out into the cold water, my boots splashing softly as I moved toward the concrete pillars, trying to keep my back to the wall. That was when I saw it. A second caution sign, identical to the first, sitting in the middle of the basement floor. On top of the sign was my own spare set of keys, the ones I had left in the security office on the ground floor only an hour ago. My heart dropped into my stomach as I realized that while I was patrolling the upper floors, someone had been in my office, watching me on the monitors and planning exactly how to bring me down here. I heard a soft metallic clink from behind me, and I spun around just in time to see the elevator gate sliding shut. Through the iron mesh, I saw a figure standing inside the lift, a person wearing a high-visibility construction vest and a hard hat, their face obscured by the deep shadows of the brim. They didn't move or speak. They simply reached out a gloved hand and pressed the button for the top floor. As the elevator began to rise, leaving me stranded in the dark, the figure tilted their head slightly, a silent acknowledgement that they now had full control of the building and I was locked in the one place no one would think to look. I didn't panic, though every instinct told me to scream. I knew this building better than the intruder did, and I remembered a small ventilation shaft in the boiler room that led to the sidewalk grate outside. I scrambled through the dark, my flashlight beam dancing wildly over the rusted machinery, until I found the narrow opening. I hauled myself up into the cramped, dusty tunnel, my heart pounding against my ribs as I clawed my way toward the faint smell of city exhaust and the dim glow of the streetlights. When I finally burst through the grate and onto the cold pavement, I didn't stop to look back at the hotel. I ran 2 blocks to the nearest police precinct, my clothes soaked in basement water and my hands shaking so hard I could barely point to the building on a map. When the officers arrived and searched the hotel, they found the service elevator stopped on the roof, the gate wide open and the motor burnt out. Inside the elevator was a single Polaroid photo, still damp from the developer, showing me from behind as I stood in the basement, completely unaware of the person standing just inches away in the shadows. I quit that job the next morning, and now, every time I step into an elevator, I check the corners of the floor and the gaps in the door before I ever let that gate close behind me. They say that the most dangerous predators are the ones who don't make a sound, the ones who blend into the background of your daily life until the very moment they decide to reach out and grab you. I was working the graveyard shift at a gas station on the edge of a desolate highway, a place where the wind howled through the power lines and the only visitors were tired truckers or people who didn't want to be found. The station was a small, glass-walled box that felt more like a fishbowl than a building, leaving me exposed to the vast, dark emptiness of the surrounding woods. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, the hour when the world feels thin and the shadows seem to stretch longer than they should, and I was busy trying to distract myself from the silence by counting the inventory on the bottom shelves. The neon lights overhead hummed with a low, buzzing vibration that filled the room, a sound that usually comforted me but tonight felt like it was masking something much more sinister. I was kneeling on the cold linoleum floor, reaching into the back of a cabinet to organize the motor oil, when I accidentally knocked my heavy metal pen off the counter. It skittered across the floor and rolled behind the main register area, disappearing into the dark gap where the wooden base of the counter met the floorboards. I let out a frustrated sigh and crawled over on my hands and knees, clicking my flashlight on to find where the pen had landed in the dust. I swept the beam of light along the floor, expecting to see nothing but lint and old receipts, but the light hit something that made my heart stop in my chest and my breath catch in my throat. There, tucked deep into the recessed space beneath the counter where the customers couldn't see, was a pair of muddy, salt-stained work boots. They weren't just sitting there. They were occupied, the thick laces pulled tight around ankles that were hidden by the dark fabric of heavy trousers. I froze, my hand trembling as the light wavered, realizing that a man was lying flat on his stomach in the crawl space just inches from my own knees. He was so still that he could have been a statue, his presence completely silent even as I had spent the last hour whistling and walking back and forth just a few feet away from him. My mind began to race, calculating how long he had been there, watching the hem of my pants move past him while he waited for me to drop my guard. I wanted to scream, to bolt for the glass door and run into the darkness of the highway, but I knew that if I moved too quickly, he would reach out and snag my ankle before I could even make it to the exit. I forced myself to stay silent, my lungs burning as I took shallow, quiet breaths, trying to pretend that I hadn't seen him at all. I slowly sat back up, my muscles screaming with tension as I moved with agonizing slowness, making sure my shadow didn't betray my sudden terror. I stood behind the register, my hands shaking so violently that I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from falling over. I knew I had to get to the phone, but the landline was mounted on the wall right next to where his head would be, and my cell phone was sitting on the charging dock across the room. I was trapped in a glass cage with a predator who was literally at my feet, and every second that passed felt like an eternity in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The silence in the station suddenly felt heavy and suffocating, as if the air itself were pressing down on me, and I realized the buzzing of the neon lights had stopped. In the sudden quiet, I heard it. A faint, wet sound of someone licking their lips, coming from the floorboards right beneath my feet. He knew that I knew. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I saw a single, gloved finger slowly reach out from the shadows of the counter to trace the line of my sneaker. It was a taunt, a slow and deliberate movement meant to show me just how much power he had over me in this isolated, glass-walled trap. I didn't think. I acted on pure, raw instinct, grabbing the heavy glass coffee carafe from the warmer and slamming it down onto the counter to create a deafening distraction. As the glass shattered and the hot liquid splashed everywhere, I turned and lunged for the back office door, which I knew had a heavy steel bolt on the inside. I could hear him scrambling out from under the floorboards now, the sound of his heavy boots thudding against the linoleum as he realized his prey was trying to escape. I dived into the small, cramped office and threw my weight against the door, sliding the bolt home just as a heavy shoulder slammed into the other side with enough force to make the hinges groan. He didn't yell or growl. He just kept hitting the door with a rhythmic, terrifying persistence, each blow vibrating through my entire body. I grabbed the office phone and dialed the emergency number, my voice a frantic whisper as I gave the operator my location and told her someone was trying to kill me. On the other side of the door, the thudding suddenly stopped, replaced by a scratching sound, as if he were trying to find a gap in the wood or a way to pick the lock. "I can see you through the vent," a voice whispered, a low and gravelly sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I looked up at the small air grate near the ceiling and saw a pair of dark, unblinking eyes staring back at me, watching my every move with a detached, cold curiosity. He wasn't even trying to hide his face anymore, and the look in his eyes told me that he had done this before, and he intended to do it again. I retreated to the furthest corner of the office, clutching a heavy letter opener as my only weapon, and waited for the police to arrive while the man on the other side of the door began to hum a soft, tuneless melody. When the sirens finally began to wail in the distance, the humming stopped instantly, followed by the sound of the gas station's front door swinging open and the bell chiming a cheerful ding that felt like a mockery of my terror. By the time the officers burst into the station with their guns drawn, the man was gone, vanished into the tree line like a ghost in the fog. They found the muddy prints where he had been lying under the counter, and they found a small, sharp knife he had dropped in his haste to escape, but they never found the man himself. I never went back to that gas station, and even now, years later, I cannot stand to be in a room where I cannot see what is hiding beneath the furniture.